This is lecture 28D in the ABCs of Communism series. My name's Jason Smith. This is based upon what's going to be chapter 45 in next year's ABCs of Communism Bolshevism 2016 edition, which I call Mexico Part 3, The Empire Strikes Back, 20 Years of CIA Rule. We're going to discuss three presidents in this lecture. Vicente Fox Quesada, who was president from 2000 to 2006. The man he selected to be his successor, Felipe Calderon, who ruled from 2006 to 2012. And the man that took his place in an election, another PRI candidate, Enrique Pena Nieto. What all three of these particular presidents have in common is that they were all part of the U.S. neoliberal stooge tradition of CIA rule over Mexico. And they also have in common the fact that they were all narco presidents, that is, drug presidents. And the first of which we're going to start with is Vicente Fox Quesada. As I say, he ruled from 2000 to 2006. He was a Mexican businessman, former president of CocaCola of Mexico, and then the president of, and then the National Action Party candidate for president in 2000. And when he won that election, it meant the first time that the Party of Institutional Revolution had lost an election since 1924, when Plutarco Calles, the predates itself from 1924 when Plutarco Calles won that election. And so just the fact that he was not a pre-president was a kind of revolutionary development in and of itself. Now, he was born in the Mexican city of Guanajuato on the 2nd of July 1942, which makes him 73 years old today, same as me. His father was Jose Luis Fox Pont, a native-born Mexican, and his mother Mercedes Quesada, from a Basque from San Sebastian in Spain. His paternal grandfather was born Joseph Louis Fuchs in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was the son of a German Catholic immigrant. They changed their name from Fuchs to Fox sometimes during the 1870s to anglicize it. At any rate, Fox spent his childhood and his adolescence at the family ranch in San Francisco del Rincon in Guanajuato. He moved to Mexico City after that, and well, we'll pick up the story from there. He got his degree, his first degree, in his bachelor's degree from the Ibero-American University, Universidad Iberoamericana, in Mexico City, in business administration in 1964, and then he got a master's degree from Harvard Business School in the U.S. in 1974. In 1964, he had gone to work for the Coca-Cola company in Mexico. Now, there's one of these self-congratulatory Wikipedia pages that he obviously wrote himself, the essence of it is that he started driving this delivery truck for Coca-Cola, and then he worked himself up. But that should, on the surface of it, be kind of surprising that a delivery truck driver could suddenly become the president of the entire company for Mexico. But for those of us who know the drug business in Latin America, the obvious thing that stands out is that everybody that knows the drug business in Latin America knows that the Coca-Cola company processing plant in Trujillo, Peru, has always been the source of pure cocaine in that cocaine business in Latin America. Now, in 1911, when the U.S. outlawed cocaine in Coca-Cola, they didn't stop producing. They just took their cocaine and started selling it on the wholesale market. So becoming president of Coca-Cola anywhere like Mexico means that you have some kind of important connection to the drug business. And of course Fox did have that connection. One of the first things he did when he became president was to take the side of the Sinaloa cartel against the Gulf Coast cartel. I'm using the English names here frequently because I think it'll be easier for you to follow. And when he did that, he introduced himself into the arms struggle that goes on to this very day in Mexico between different cartels. The most recent president of Mexico has been reduced to being the head of the fifth biggest cartel in Mexico. But that's just kind of an aside, not really that important here or there. Fox had started out as a governor of the state of Guanajuato in 1991, but he eventually took the leadership of the National Action Party and began to operate on a national scale. Now this is important in the sense that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency had been trying for several decades to destroy the PRI as a party, and we've talked a little bit about that in previous lectures. Well, the fact that they had now decided to support Fox and the National Action Party had far-reaching ramifications. The not just getting him elected, but the things that they did in other ways to try and destroy the PRI party, and also they needed now to destroy the PRD party, the Party of Revolutionary Democracy, started by the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, and that was a party that had always had control of Mexico City since it had been initiated because of the strong working class concentration in Mexico City. They were loyal to Lázaro Cárdenas, wanted somebody that was an honest man, as Lázaro Cárdenas had been, to become president of Mexico, and they had settled largely upon his son, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. So he was running against Fox for that presidency in the 2000 election, as were two other men. Now, we don't need to go into a great deal of this, but something very important happened in January of 2001. That is, in the first month after Fox took over the presidency, and that was that a man named El Chapo was released by the government from prison. And so at that moment, the federal government had taken a step on the side of the Sinaloa cartel. Now, you may have read recently that El Chapo was recaptured after all of these years and is again in prison in Mexico. The gringo regime wants him extradited to the U.S. Whether that happens or not is questionable, because the current president of Mexico has not nearly as much power as presidents used to have, because he was elected with only 39% of the vote against three other men who split up the rest of the vote, and he doesn't even have a majority in either house. Of course, the CIA could do what they often do and just kidnap him and bring him to the States, but there are good reasons to believe that they may be afraid to do that, because El Chapo is a man who obviously has been around for a long time running the drug cartels, and that means that he has been at various times on the CIA payroll or allied with them. To get an idea of the complexities of this, I suggest you take a look at some of those Breaking Bad episodes where Walter White and his sidekicks end up down in Mexico and taking one side of the drug war against the others, and in this case it's methamphetamine they're fighting over, but whether it's methamphetamine, cocaine, or heroin, these guys have been running the drug war down there for a long time, and the deaths just in Michoacan are now up to about 120,000 dead. That's in the year 2013. Now, I don't think it takes very much convincing for you to see that Mexico is already in another civil war. The fact that the cap press in the U.S. won't tell you about it shouldn't be too surprising because they don't tell you the truth about anything. And it doesn't matter who they are, whether it's NPR, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, they're all the same. They all get their orders from the same place. Some of them may have a slightly different twist on it than others, depending upon peculiarities. Like Murdoch owns Fox, so he puts it out with his little bit of a spin. But the basic story is always the same. Whatever they get from the State Department and the Defense Department is what they publish. So, at any rate, they let El Chapo out of jail in 2001, and as one expert says, what this did was to show us where Fox was in the drug war. So, at any rate, Fox received a tremendous amount of coverage of a completely different kind in the U.S. press, which treated him very friendly, primarily because he was a neoliberal kind of guy, the kind of guy they want to have that was willing to turn Mexico into a slave labor colony for big U.S. corporations. And and when he took the office on December 1st, 2000, it marked the first time in Mexican's history that an incumbent government peacefully surrendered power to an elected representative of the opposition, but it also marked a surrender of power to the U.S. government and especially to the CIA, which was behind the scenes, as we have seen when we were talking about the Zapatista National Liberation Army. It was they who had decided to force the Cedillo administration into an armed conflict with the Zapatistas, which they quickly lost. The Mexican army got whipped and had to retreat to not that they didn't keep trying to do it now and then, but each time they tried to attack the Zapatistas, they got forced back. And Fox decided that the best thing he could do was just contain them in quarantine of virtually the entire state of Chiapas, with San Cristobal de las Casas as their capital city. Now, that's a city I got to know reasonably well when I was assistant manager for NL Industries in Villahermosa, Tabasco, because it's a reasonably short drive from there. It's also a city that's historically well known because Graham Greene, in his militant Catholic years, made it that far when he was suffering an extreme case of dysentery. And when you read his book, Another Mexico, you can kind of get a feeling of what it's like to have dysentery in Mexico, because he was kind of semi-hallucinatory during most of that period, as he himself says, and which he spent in San Cristobal de las Casas, where he managed to save his life and eventually get out of the country. Sometimes the only way you can get over Montezuma's revenge down there is just to get out of Mexico altogether. But at any rate, Fox got to be fairly well known for his various trips around the rest of Mexico, and he always put on quite a little bit of a show. But he also started getting in trouble every time he'd shoot his mouth off about politics. He, for example, had made some statements a couple years into his administration that the Mexicans should be treated better in the U.S. because they did jobs there that even blacks won't do, he said. Well, that meant black leaders said, "What do you mean even blacks won't do? What are we, some kind of a subclass?" So that, or subspecies. So that pissed them off, and he kept sticking his foot in his mouth every time he turned around in terms of his trip to the United States, where he went to talk to Mexicans who were allowed to vote in Mexican elections, and the U.S. Los Angeles is the second biggest concentration of Mexicans in the world, next to Mexico City. So Mexican presidents often find it necessary to go up there for one reason or another in an electoral campaign, or just to keep people happy. So he got into trouble with Al Sharpton and some of these other guys. He couldn't even get along with Bill O'Reilly on Fox, who questioned him about well, why is it that all these Mexicans are flooding into the United States illegally? And he got mad at Bill O'Reilly and walked off his show. Things like this. I mean, he wasn't very good at getting along with people that he should have been able to get along with. I mean, if a right-winger can't get along with Bill O'Reilly, you have to ask yourself, what's the problem here? So lots of people kept asking themselves about Fox and the fact that he couldn't seem to keep his foot out of his mouth whenever he talked in the United States. When in 2006, when Evo Morales refused to sell natural gas to privately, he said, well, if they don't sell it, they're going to have to eat it or consume it themselves. So no matter what he did, he didn't seem to have much sense with regard to politics. Well, other things happened down there. There were some Canadians that got murdered in Cancun, and he blamed this on other Canadians that he said were responsible. And the problem was that he didn't want to lose the Canadian tourist industry or he didn't want to lose Cancun as a basic area of profit making. So he couldn't get along with Telemundo, which is a CIA construct itself. So he was a loose cannon in many ways. But the important thing is that he was a neoliberal president, and that means that he did turn over more and more companies to privateers, privatize them, of course, to members of his own gang. And he was a narco president, the first of the big three narco presidents that Mexico's had. And he got directly involved in the Sinaloa versus the Gulf Cartel War, as we've already mentioned. And at this point, I think what I'm going to do is move on to the successor, to his successor. He picked Felipe Calderon to be the PAN, the National Action Party candidate, the party he belonged to be his successor. And we're going to go on to that next. Felipe Calderon was born on the 18th of August of 1962. And he is the president who served from 2006 to 2012. He was a National Action Party member from the time of his youth. Now, that meant that he didn't get to actually participate in politics because in his youth, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, controlled all of the states virtually and cities in Mexico. And so you could do whatever you wanted with the paw, and it didn't really make much difference. But after Vicente Fox got the election, the previous presidency, of course everything changed, because one thing Fox did was to continue the precondition of tradition of picking his successor. And the man he picked was Felipe Calderon Hinojosa. Now, the important thing about Calderon is that he immediately stepped up the so-called drug war. Now, in the cap press in the U.S., they pretended like this was a war against drug gangs, but what it was a war of the gang that Calderon belonged to, the one that he was loyal to, against the others. And in the first 6 years, in the 6 years of his administration, in the state of Michoacan alone, there were 60,000 dead. This is the same state that now has 120,000 dead in the year 2013. So this is just an incredible number. Now this is going on in the country on our border immediately to the south. So this is a country that has been now for many years in a state of outright civil war, which the U.S. cap press likes to portray as a war between drug gangs, which it is, but it's far more important than just, it's not as if it was divorced in some way from U.S. politics, because it's the CIA which is directly involved in all of this. They're involved in the assassinations that go on down there. They're involved in the war against the Zapatistas. They're directing all of this. They allowed Calderon to take the presidency because they considered him to be about the best of the alternatives that they had available, and he was a man that they knew because he'd been on their payroll all of his life. So one of the first things he did in this so-called drug war was what he called Operation Michoacan. The first large-scale armed exercise where 6,500 federal army troops were deployed and directed against certain drug cartels. By the end of his administration, as I say, the death toll of the Mexican drug war was at least 60,000, and estimates set the death toll about 120,000 by 2013, not including 27,000 missing people. The murder rate has skyrocketed during his presidency and that of his successor. Felipe Calderon was born in Morelia, Michoacan. He is the youngest of 5 brothers and the son of Carmen Hinojosa Calderon and the late Luis Calderon Vega. His father was co-founder of the National Action Party and an important political figure. The elder Calderon occupied state posts and served a term as a federal deputy. He spent most of his life working within the party and spent most of his free time promoting the PAN, the National Action Party. Young Calderon was active in his father's campaigns, and as a boy, he distributed party pamphlets and flyers, and he rode the PAN campaign vehicles and chanted slogans at rallies, and in many ways reminds me of what I did with my father when he was running for Attorney General back in 1954. At any rate, after growing up in Morelia, Calderon moved to Mexico City, where he received a bachelor's degree in law from the Escuela Libre de Derecho, and later he received a master's degree in economics from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, and a master's in public administration degree in 2000 from the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. Following his father's example, he joined the PAN. It was the National Action Party. In the National Action Party that Calderon met his wife Margarita Zavala, who served in Congress as a federal deputy. They had 3 children. Now, I'm going to skip over a certain amount of this, and we'll get on to, because we have a limited amount of time here, and the individual details of their lives aren't all that important at this particular point. The important thing is what their politics were. Calderon was a local representative in the Legislative Assembly in his state and then in the Federal Chamber of Deputies. He ran for the governorship of Michoacan in 95, and he served as the national president of the PAN from 96 to 99. During his tenure, his party maintained control of 14 state capitals and also faced a reduced presence in the Federal Chamber of Deputies. Soon after Vicente Fox took office as president, Calderon was appointed director of Banobras, a state-owned development bank. And of course, by now you know that anytime a Mexican government employee is appointed head of a state bank, that this is a source of corruption. And of course, so he was true to tradition, and he was accused by his opponents of committing all kinds of abuse, legal abuse of legal procedures, way finances were handed out, and all kinds of accusations were made of one kind or another, which we don't need to worry about, because this is an inside fighting within the ruling class itself. The important thing is that Mexican workers are completely outside of all of this. He joined the presidential cabinet as Secretary of Energy under Vicente Fox, and he left that post in May 2004 in protest of Vicente Fox's criticism of his presidential ambitions while supporting those of Santiago Creel. But they worked that out among themselves, so members of his party chose him as the PAN presidential candidate in a series of 3 primary elections. He defeated the favored former Secretary of the Interior that Vicente Fox had initially wanted to appoint, and thus the election of Calderon as party candidate was assured, and then Vicente Fox said, "Oh, all right, well, Calderon's not a bad guy after all, I guess we'll appoint him." And then now he has to run for election. Now, this time he was running against López Obrador, who had the election stolen from him earlier, and now he's going to run again. Some polls favored Obrador by as much as 9 points. This trend continued, and on the night of the election, Calderon had only about half of a percentage point a lead in even the government's official polls, which shows you how shaky this whole transition is going to be. So in the House of Deputies, that is the lower house of the Mexican Congress, the PRD, the Party of the Democratic Revolution, for whom Obrador was the candidate, had said they were going to refuse to let Calderon take the oath of office, and so they set up a plan to prevent him from being sworn in. Traditionally, presidents had always been sworn in there, but this time that wasn't going to be possible. So what happened was that Vicente Fox agreed to stand side by side in a separate national television conference and hand the presidential sash to Calderon. And that's what happened. And later on, they managed to get him approved in the House of Deputies. But as you can see, just the transition itself from Fox to Calderon was not easy, and it had required breaking all kinds of previous presidential traditions. Well, it was expected that Calderon would continue the foreign policy started by Fox, which is known as the Casa Mia doctrine. Mainly, what that was about is this man Castañeda, who was reasonably well-known Mexican author, had decided that the Fox and Calderon PPP program should be the answer to Hugo Chavez's ALBA down in Venezuela, and so that automatically set up the CIA conflict that they hoped that they were going to be able to pull off against Hugo Chavez, which would feature some kind of leading Latin American elements. In the end, it didn't work, but that doesn't mean they didn't give it a good try. And that was the Puebla-Panama plan that the CIA had come up with, and the Mexicans now were under Vicente Fox and Calderon were fronting it. And Jorge Castañeda is this well-known author who was their Secretary of Foreign Affairs during the first half of Fox's administration, and he was the one that had said that, well, we'll fight Hugo Chavez and his ALBA program, and that ALBA program being the Latin American Alliance, the Bolivarian Alliance for Latin America, I guess would be the best place to put it, which features Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia as its founding members, and now it's much larger. It includes Brazil and Paraguay, and I'm not sure who all, but at any rate, another landmark they proposed was the so-called Merida Initiative, which was supposed to be the U.S. government's answer to what should be done in Central America. During the first months of his administration, Calderon took several different actions. One was called the Tortilla Price Stabilization Pact, and what that has to do with is the fact that tortillas are a staple, as I'm sure you know, of the Mexican diet of the poor. And these are made primarily from corn. And when the price of corn shot up because of these agribusiness operations, it would have been out. This corn mill would have been outside of their ability to buy it. So, what the Calderon government did was to raise the price of this flour up to about 10 pesos per kilogram from where it had been at about 3 pesos, and then say, well, this is the stable price. From now on, it won't be any higher than that. Of course, they'd already more than doubled it. But at any rate, Calderon then got involved in trying to satisfy a certain number of people with expansion of the health program, but that also turned into being kind of a scam. And you could get on it, but there were all kinds of things that you had to do in order to qualify for it, not the least of which is you had to agree to not get involved in left-wing politics, and you had to agree to the wage scales that the government was proposing. Calderon created another 16,500 kilometers of federal highway. Most of this was because the tanks that he was sending all over the country to establish order and impose his drug gangs rule were too heavy for these old Mexican roads, and they couldn't get around, so they had to actually spend some money on building some roads. The economic policy that Calderon followed was to create a GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, so that Mexico became the 11th largest in the world as of 2011, and public policy sought to create so-called quality jobs, reduce poverty, and protect the standard of living of all classes. Well, of course, that's their description for what they did, which was quite different. What they did was to assure that Mexicans would work for dirt cheap wages of around $1 a day, and that if they did that, then they could be eligible for certain kinds of health programs and so on. The infrastructure had to be rebuilt in certain areas because there had been so little actual public financing of infrastructure for so long. So some projects were undertaken which had remarkable structures. The Baluarte Bridge was inaugurated that speeds travel between the coastal resort town of Mazatlan and the state of Coahuila, and allows for faster access between Mexico's coast. And that bridge is so high at a certain point that the Eiffel Tower could fit under its central span. At any rate, various kinds of interesting things developed with regard to investments under Calderon, and of course, in his trade policy, he moved to expand new export opportunities that attract employment and diversify Mexico's crucial export sector away from what they called excessive dependence on the U.S. market. And so what it really was an expansion of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allowed virtual complete access to Mexico of U.S. corporations, and only the biggest Mexican corporations could thereby compete and go into the U.S. at the same time. We don't need to spend too much more time on that. We have already talked about NAFTA to a certain degree. You know what a tremendous destructive factor that had. We've just talked about the price ceilings on tortilla, which were really just a way of raising the price to 8.5 pesos per kilogram, which was more than twice of the original price. But at any rate, then they said, well, then it won't go any higher than that. These phony programs kept coming up again and again, and of course they would describe them in one way, but in the realities, if you were to take a look at oppositional press in North America or in Mexico, you would see that they were quite different than the way they were being advertised. More programs, more companies were privatized, more of state companies I'm talking about, and that pretty well speaks for itself. The so-called security policy would involve massive government raids on some drug cartels, and that had begun in December 2006, right after he took over, right after Calderon took over, and some of the most intense ones were in his home state of Michoacan, because that's where he was most deeply involved in the drug trade itself. So he wanted to get things straightened out down there because he had a direct profit motive involved in the Michoacan, and that's where 60,000 people were killed in the 6 years of his administration. Now 120,000 dead so far. At any rate, and then the Diasparada gang got kind of wiped out. That was an enemy gang down there during the course of that, and the government announced that it would extradite some of these drug gang leaders to the United States. Well, this is something that hadn't happened in Mexico before. Mexico refused to extradite anybody to the United States, so this was another reversal of a long-standing Mexican policy. The Mexican government ordered Mexican soldiers and federal police into several cities, especially Tijuana, that's that's Baja California, and Ciudad Juarez. And then in Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, the Army ordered that all local police officers surrender their weapons, as they suspected that many of these cops had ties to drug cartels, by which they mean other drug cartels. Other states where actions were taken were in Michoacan, Tamaulipas, Tabasco, and Guerrero. In January 2007, in interviews with the Financial Times, Calderon said, "We've received very encouraging results in the state of Michoacan. For example, the murder rate has fallen almost 40%. Well, shortly thereafter, even the Mexican press pointed out that that was not true. This was the kind of stuff that they kept stepping into. Every time they would announce that they had done something, closed down so many drug cartels or one thing or another, the oppositional press would say, well, that's not true either, and then they would come up with some other things. Like they closed down, they say 52,842 marijuana farms, 33,019 opium poppy farms, and then the reports claims that these results stopped the distribution of 1.5 million doses of marijuana, 18 million doses of cocaine, 94 million doses of heroin, and so on and so forth. And all of that turned out to be false. Well, then the Mexican Navy killed Arturo Beltran Leyva, a once important drug trafficker, on December 16th of 2009, and that intensified the fighting between some of these drug cartels and the Calderon army cartel. I could keep on going through these. I don't think, but it's the same thing. There's a large number of people being killed everywhere. And it's always a war between the Calderon cartel and other cartels. And so, as far as Mexican workers are concerned, they're still down here working for $1 a day in common laborers, and the only ones that have any decent salaries are unionized in auto factories, and their wages have been frozen. Well, in the 2006 election, the Federal Election Institute announced that the race was too close to call, and they chose not to make that public. But and the thing was contested, and eventually Calderon was allowed to take the presidency under very suspicious circumstances, and the sash passed from Vicente Fox to Calderon. Then there was the U.S. espionage scandal on July 10th, 2013, when the Mexican major ruling class newspaper Excelsior ran an article on its website revealing that the Calderon administration authorized on February 2007, the first year of right after he was elected, the installation of an interception system by the U.S. Department of State to analyze, process, and store phone calls, emails, and other internet services with the purpose of helping the Calderon administration fight organized crime and narco traffic. Well, I think that speaks for itself. This is at the same time that the Edward Snowden revelations have shown what the NSA was really up to worldwide. But it also showed what Excelsior was interested in was the fact that they had this was proof that they were directly involved in keeping Calderon in office and in getting him there in the first place, and at any rate. Then Enrique Pena Nieto is the next guy that we want to take a look at, and we're going to go on to that next. Enrique Pena Nieto, the current Mexican president, was born on July 20th of 1966. He's the 57th president of Mexico. His 6-year term began in 2012, just 3 years ago. He's a member of the PRI. So, the National Action Party got beat. They were pushed aside. Their record was so bad that they really weren't re-electable. So what that left was the Party of the Democratic Revolution of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, or the PRI, which all of a sudden is starting to look better to Mexicans who remember that, well, at least in the PRI days they could get things done. And so their candidate, Enrique Pena Nieto, won the election with 39% of the vote, which is not very much, but because there were 4 candidates total, the other 3 split it up. At any rate, he managed to bring the PRI back as a name anyway, as the governing party in Mexico, and I wouldn't venture to guess what's going to happen, because frankly I'll be surprised if Pena Nieto survives assassination and fills out his term. But even if he should, the chance that the PRI is going, or anybody else of the traditional political establishment, is going to be allowed to take the presidency in Mexico City is pretty small. Between the Zapatistas is heating up, and everybody can see that they're the only ones that could probably defeat these various drug gangs, because they at least have a reliable and honest army that they can field. Whereas the drug cartels, Their guys fight for money. As long as they can be paid, they'll fight up to a certain point. But there's a completely, we went all through this in Cuba against Fulgencio Batista. When you're up against an army that's composed of people that are there for 3 hots and a cot, or whatever money they can make as private contractors, and against a spiritually superior army, we know who always wins those kinds of fights. So Mexico's civil war is going to transform, I think, in the near future into being what it is right now, a dogfight between contending forces of pigs that are at the trough, and into a real class war where the Zapatista National Liberation Army and the Mexican honest unions, to the degree that there are any left, will lead the fight against the others, and we'll have another Mexican Civil War like the one of 1910 to 1934. That's what I'm predicting. The U.S. may get involved in that because, they're set up as a constant war state, so it wouldn't be surprising to me if they get involved, but why would they have any more luck in Mexico than they've had in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, or any other place where they've intervened? Remember, the U.S. hasn't won a war since 1945. They've been constantly at war because that's what the war contractors want, but because that's where the money is, but they haven't won anything. At any rate, the return of the PRI was not welcomed by everyone. Marches against Pena Nieto drew tens of thousands of people across Mexico, particularly from an organization called Yo Soy 132, or 132, student movement, and they protested the voting irregularities, the media bias, meaning the fact that the television and radio stations were all repeating the government line. Others protested that during its time in power, the PRI had become a symbol of corruption, repression, economic mismanagement, and electoral fraud. Many Mexicans and urban dwellers worried that its return to power might signify a return to Mexico's past. And Pena Nieto promised that his government would be much more democratic, modern, and open to criticism. But that's what every candidate has said in Mexico for the last 70-odd years, so that's never been true. Now, Pena Nieto promised that his government would fight organized crime and drug trade, and of course by this time the Mexican people know that all of these presidents, whether it was Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderon, or this new guy, they're all drug presidents. So all of this is just talk that goes in one ear and out the other as far as most Mexicans are concerned. Now, up here in Gringolandia, you never know how much we have the most ignorant population of the industrial world, which means they're often the most stupid. So if there's anything that's exceptional about the U.S. electorate, it's they're exceptionally ignorant, which leads to exceptional stupidity. All you have to do is watch Mark Dice occasionally to see just how bad the ignorance of the U.S. population is. So they are exceptional in that regard. The rule of the PAN was marked by an inability to pass reform, and the party had lacked a congressional majority. And now the PRI said, well, we can fix it all up. But what the big thing for Pena Nieto is he is supposed to turn Pemex over to privateers. Now, that would require a change in the Mexican Constitution, and it would require all kinds of changes in Mexican law. He doesn't have anywhere near a majority in either House of Congress to accomplish these things, and so they have been bureaucratically bottlenecked. But Pemex, everybody knows, is at risk. Now, if there's one institution that the Mexican bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie are institutionalized in, it's Petróleos Mexicanos. So that they're not going to allow that to happen. And nor is the working class. The STPRM may not have its old leader anymore, and it doesn't, but its new leaders are no more likely to want to give up their position, which is based upon doing a good job for 200,000 Pemex workers, than anybody else is. So the civil war that's breeding in Mexico now, this transition from an inter-drug gang war into a class war, is going to be, I believe, you can see it's going to start out over a fight over Pemex, and that we'll just have to see how everything goes. Well, Pena Nieto himself was born in 1966, in Atlacomulco, that's a town in the state of Mexico, 55 miles northwest of the country's capital, that is, of the federal district. He's the oldest of 4 siblings in a middle-class family. His father was an electrical engineer and his mother a school teacher. Unlike many of Mexico's past presidents, Pena Nieto did not study at an American university, but he did attend Dennis Hall School in Alfred, Maine for 1 year of junior high school in 1979, where he learned how to speak English, and according to what I've seen on TV, his English is pretty good. People who knew him up there said that he was already a sharp dresser and he was planning on being governor of the state of Mexico. So, yeah, that's where he was in junior high school. His nickname was Quique, a nickname in short for Enrique, and he had distinguished himself in childhood for being courteous and tidy and well-groomed. His mother recalls how she would squeeze lime juice on Pena Nieto's hair to keep his now famous hairstyle in place. Well, we could go on through some of this, but in 1984, at the age of 18, he traveled to Mexico City, enrolled in the Pan American University, Universidad Panamericana, where he earned a bachelor's degree in law. He later went on to obtain a master's degree in business administration from the Monterrey Institute of Technology and Higher Education, ITESM. Pena Nieto joined the Institutional Revolutionary Party in 1984, and then he worked his way up through their party structure. In his final years in college, he was a public notary in Mexico City. Well, that's a far more important position, a notary there, than it is here. And at any rate, I wanted to get up here to the part about his wife. He during his second year in office, in other words, just a couple years ago, Pena Nieto's wife, Monica Pretellini, died on the 11th of January 2007. Now, her neurologist stated that Pretellini suffered an epileptic seizure at around 1 o'clock in the morning, and then went through various, but she was brain dead at the ABC hospital after treatment in the emergency room in Mexico City, and he was notified at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, this couple had been married in 1993, and they had 3 children. Now, even the Wikipedia article about him points out that the most important rumor in Mexico, and the biggest controversy about her death, is that most Mexicans think that Pena Nieto killed her. And this is actually, for something like a Wikipedia official page to even bring that up, shows you just how suspicious the Mexican people must be if they felt that they had to report this fact. Well, at any rate, I have no inside knowledge about that one way or the other, but nothing these guys do anymore surprises me. I mean, they kill so many people all the time that it makes The Sopranos look like a Sunday school picnic. But at any rate, Pena Nieto was the last standing nominee of the PRI, and he won that 2012 presidential election. The former governor of the state of Mexico completed his nomination, and 6 days later they managed to get him the election. So he wrote a book. If you're interested, you can read it, where he tells his story about his administration so far. As I say, you can take a look at the Wikipedia article. They've had a hard time trying to keep their story straight because I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Wikipedia, but the people that write those pages are always, when it's about a Mexican president anyway, always have an axe to grind. And sometimes other places too, so you have to kind of read them carefully. And even though Wikipedia doesn't approve of or allow formally people to write their own pages, they do it anyway, and they figure out different ways of getting it published. So the Wikipedia page on Pena Nieto is still kind of confused because they haven't been able to get their story together. It's not just a matter of how his wife died, whether she was murdered or not, but there have been a bunch of other things that have come up. Not the least of which is that his new wife has a $7 million house in Mexico City, which he failed to list among his assets. And this has been brought out in even the subservient Mexican press, and you can read about it there. I'm not going to go into that, all of these different contradictions that you can now see in the Pena Nieto administration, except to say that I know from my own sources that the probability that this guy is going to survive the same way Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon did is not very high. Everybody I know is betting that he's soon going to be assassinated and that Mexico's class war is going to emerge from this so-called drug war. People I know, I think, are pretty well informed, so that may be very well how things develop. I think I'm going to stop this lecture at this particular point because you've got the picture. To summarize this whole thing, as soon as Cedillo finished his office, he was, of course, a neoliberal president, but he did such a bad job that he had left the situation open. The CIA was able to bring the National Action Party in under Vicente Fox, but this is a guy that couldn't keep his foot out of his mouth. He was the first of the great drug presidents in Mexico, and he picked his own successor, Felipe Calderon, eventually, and he was the second great drug president of Mexico. Under him, the drug war stepped up because he got personally involved with the people that he knew best, that he'd been working with in Michoacan, his home state, and now you've got 120,000 dead, 27,000 missing. You don't need much of an imagination to see that this is a true civil war that's already going on. It's only going to take a spark to flip this thing into a full-fledged class war. I think that spark will come once they try to sell Pemex to private U.S. capitalists, and the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, and working class within the Petróleos Mexicanos political establishment will revolt. And they have the armed forces also in the form of the Zapatista National Liberation Army. Putting those two together, remember these Zapatistas are a real smart bunch, and they have some top intellectual leaders. So putting these two groups together is going to be almost automatic. What the U.S. does, the official U.S. government does in response to this, is anybody's guess. But their traditional response is to start bombing people. And I would imagine that they'll start bombing their enemies as they see them in Mexico. And that brings us to a conclusion of our four lectures on the Empire Strikes Back. Next we're going to in Mexico. Next we're going to go to the Empire Strikes Back in Cuba and Central America, and we'll have several lectures on that. And that's going to be, I'm writing those chapters right now, so that's going to be a couple weeks probably before we do our first ABCs of Communism lecture in this YouTube series.